communicate with everybody now. So I'm going to pull up a little presentation. We're going to do exactly what Sarah was alluding to. I'm going to introduce myself a little bit, and I'm going to talk about, at least in my experience, some of the pitfalls of how you get from doing some great user research to actually results in an organization. And in particular, we'll be looking a little bit at what are all the ways that that can fail along the way, right? So that is what we're going to get into, and I will share my screen. What I'll say as we're going through this is I'm really a very casual, laid-back person. So if you have questions along the way, please do feel free to ask me. I will be prompting for some feedback as we go through. But feel free to, come off mute and ask me a question. I'm totally happy with that. Cool. So who is this rando, right? Who is this guy who is here? So I have no idea why I have education on here. I'm just looking at this slide. I'm like, yeah, I guess I have education. Sure. I did work in a university for a little while. Maybe that's what I was thinking about. What I do have is 10 years of learnings from making a whole bunch of UX mistakes, right? So I have worked in a whole bunch of financial services and other types of companies, doing user experience and user research and all that good stuff. And I've worked in a variety of different companies. So right now I'm working in a place called Pi Insurance, and that is a startup insurtech. Before that, I worked in like a medium-sized company that was growing fairly rapidly called Rapid Finance, part of the Quicken Loans family of companies. And before that, I worked in a very large, mature company, Geico. So I've seen lots of different ways of doing UX and different scaled versions of UX, right? I'm also not getting paid. So I'm not selling you anything, right? Which is always important to know when you're listening to somebody. Over here on the right is a little bit of what they call a NASCAR slide. For those that may not be in the biz, normally you see consultants when they come in with their decks and they have all the logos up there of places that they work. That's supposed to be very impressive. And they call that the NASCAR slide. So, true to form. So you have some credibility. Here is my NASCAR slide. I'm sure there's other shit that I did that you would love to know about too. But this is a check the box activity, right? So I've worked with some companies and I've done some research. We're going to talk about a couple of different things today. We're going to talk about my rude awakening in the industry. We're going to talk about building trust, identifying key decision makers, growing your people skills, setting expectations, and how you can drive action. So when I first started UX, I read Steve Krug's 2 books, right? That was really quite a great start for me, right? And I ran a number of critical usability tests. This is actually in a major company, so feeling pretty good. And I presented my findings, and everybody in the room seemed pretty happy with those. Great. And then nothing really happened, right? We finished the meeting, and it was a brick wall. And this is why I like to share this stuff, because that was quite disappointing to me. So I sat in a corner and I cried for a little while, right? I composed myself and I tried to figure out what was going on with this, right? Because I thought that this was like quite shocking, right? And then over time I realized that in fact this is really quite common, right? And I'm going to start with a little bit of participation here. I'm going to see what you might already know or have experienced yourselves. Why does some user research never go anywhere? Nobody will get kicked off this call. I absolutely promise you.
I don't know if you can see the chat. Someone wrote, it doesn't feel actionable. Someone said money.
Yep.
It doesn't tie into existing business objectives. Didn't get buy-in from stakeholders. Feels
Yep.
overwhelming.
Yep. These are all great.
Stakeholders don't understand why the research was useful.
Yeah.
Alignment issues around priorities with design. Okay, I can't read them fast enough. They're moving too.
I got them here. These are great. Poor communication between UX and management decision makers. Sometimes projects get shelved. Absolutely. People aren't sure who is in charge, whose job it is to fix the problem. There are some great ones here, and fortunately, I think folks have some experience of this, right? And I think a couple that I'll just call out here. We'll touch on a lot of these as we go along, right? That one there, the last one around people aren't sure who's in charge or whose job it is to fix the problem is really good, right? Like in meetings, it's super helpful. Like when you have that momentum at the end of your presentation, you might even have recommendations, right? You know, being able to just ask that question in a group to be like, hey, who can take this, right? In a group setting, that is helpful because there can be a lot of peer pressure for somebody to take it, especially if there's leadership around. So that can be a useful tactic in order to actually get that to happen, right? Nobody really wants to be in the room and then nobody's willing to step up and fix the problem, right? That's often not a good look. What else do we have here? There's another one I wanted to just pull out. Stakeholders don't understand why the research is useful. That's a good one too. Like sometimes what I've seen in the past is the recommendations are they're good, but it's not clear enough, and someone hasn't connected the dots, right? Like it's pretty good, but maybe what the research says is that it will significantly increase sales. Okay, but like by how much, or how important is this, or what things would we do to do that, right? And we've got another one here. Also, people don't want more work to do, so they don't want to fix the problems. That is, in fact, very accurate, and something I was talking about recently. In innovation management theory, there is this concept of organizational slack, right? And so what that is that, you know, you've heard of some of this, right? Like Google had their 20% time, which my understanding is that kind of like faded away, right? And some of that 20% was like your 20% actual work hours, right? Amazon, I know, are still doing like 2 weeks a year. You can kind of explore and be curious about stuff, right? But for sure, if you don't have the time, people aren't going to do some of these things. So that's a very accurate point. Thank you for that. Cool. So we'll get into some more specifics. Building trust. So in my personal experience, what I see is, you know, it's not that much of a problem when you look at high performing folks with high trust. And those of you that have probably seen that viral Simon Sinek video already are familiar with this, but like really this has bared out in my experience as well too, right? And I think in UX in particular, you have a lot of people that are really technically good at research, right? They like that is their thing. Like you've been taught to have the education, you have, you know, you're starting off as an individual contributor where the accuracy of what you do is really, really important, right? So you're super high performing, but there's low trust, and that low trust may have absolutely nothing to do with you, right? At least initially, which is when you really want to start, when this matters, when you join an organization, you're trying to build that trust, right? So this is the one to kind of look out for, especially when you first join a new part of the organization or a new organization, right? So you're trying to establish credibility. You don't want to come into that meeting and be that know-it-all, right? Like lots of people in lots of companies really have no idea about user research, right? You know, great if you've landed a job in a company and they already have that culture, but in lots of places you're kind of doing that from the start. And what you don't really want to come in is start talking about, you know, intercoder reliability on your user interviews, right? Sure, that's great, and you might get people there over time, right? But that's not really where you want to start, right? And you can still show expertise without coming across too jargony, right, or too much of a know-it-all. The other one is executing on small things first. This is in line with lean UX and all sorts of agile thinking, which I'm sure you're familiar with. I will say, though, that very frequently I find that this is something that doesn't happen, right? Or perhaps more accurately, folks think that what they're going to do is small, and then it turns out not being that small. So really trying to force yourself to bite off some small chunks, especially when you just started with an organization, that helps to build your credibility and to get value out there quickly, rather than working on something for a couple of months. And then, if it works, maybe that works for you. If it doesn't work or it doesn't hit home with stakeholders, that's not an ideal position, right? Shortcut with veterans. Folks in the business are your friends, right? If you work in complex industries, which are probably most industries when you get into it, I'll certainly speak to financial services, which can be it can seem complex, right? Finding some folks that already know it and partnering with them can be the best thing to do, right? I wouldn't consider myself an expert in financial services, even working in the field for like 10 plus years, right? Like I'll always find an expert around an experience that I'm building that I can kind of, bounce ideas off ahead of time, or just learn the most important things from them, like out of the gate, right? And of course, getting to know people, meeting people across the organization, in terms of credibility, just actually, it's not terrible to be friends with people. I mean, it's not the most critical thing to, doing your job. You don't have to be very likable to get promoted in all cases. However, it sure helps quite a bit, right? So it is good to get to know folks. Identifying key decision makers. So one way to identify key decision makers is going to your organizational chart. And you may find something like this, right? And then you find out after being there for a little while that no, actually, the CEO doesn't make decisions. It's these three other C-level execs. But in more cases, it's some weird convoluted scenario like this, right? Where really you might find that Bill Analyst 2 is like super influential in what's going on. And this is actually maybe one of the most important things to know in terms of getting your research from where it is to actually getting implemented, right? So how do you figure out who the decision makers are and how decisions get made? Absolutely. Ask questions, talk to people, observe. Observe is the great one. You have all been gifted with the talent of user experience, right? You do this all the time. You're better at this than a lot of people that'll be in the room trying to figure out these things. Just observe, right? Go to the meetings, see who's like answering and pushing things forward in Slack or emails and things like that, right? It's observation. It's actually not looking at some organizational chart. It's observing what's going on in the organization. And there's a good call out there: lay low and observe for the first few weeks. Yep. First 30 days, you probably want to just kind of play it a little low key, right? Just see what's going on. Certainly, after, without a strong understanding of the business, is not a great idea to jump in and start recommending things. So that's a great call out as well, too. Cool. Growing your people skills. Woo, 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 woo. All right. This is what I learned. I grew up in Ireland, and I did undergrad and masters and all that good stuff. And I learned a lot, and I did great things in my college courses, but it was only after I progressed a certain amount in my career that I found that actually going out and socializing was the thing that took me to the next level, right? Like in some ways, that was some of the best practice that I got in terms of progressing in my career, right? It was great to know the theory, but knowing people was honestly much more effective in terms of getting from an individual contributor and beyond that, right? So actually what you're doing right now is actually great management experience, in my opinion. It can be fun too, every now and again. People skills versus technical skills. We're talking about this a little bit, but obviously just to call this out is, when you start as an individual contributor, as an IC, right, being able to execute on your research is super important, right? But as you grow and as you're now moving to scale your UX team or move to kind of build a user research culture in your organization, you're now moving away from those individual skills and you're now trying to do things like, hey, how do I raise awareness around the importance of user research? You might have to go do presentations to kind of show to folks, hey, this is what a good process looks like. You might have to do some education, evangelization, right? You might have to, again, identify some of those key decision makers and have one-on-one meetings with people that really need to get buy-in into this at the top level, right? So that you have both the bottom up but the top down approach as well too, right? So over time in your career, those people skills become much more important. And if you don't have them, you get to that point of wanting to become a leader and have direct reports. And in some cases, folks just can't make that leap, right? But everyone can really do it if they practice it. It's just you got to make the point of doing that along the way. Integrative thinking, right? Here's another key big one that I have seen be an issue, right? So you want to do some research and you want to make changes to a specific product based on that research, right? Sometimes you'll go to the department or the group that is most influential or most related to that product. But really what you should be doing is going and identifying every single stakeholder group that will be impacted by the experience that you're researching or would ultimately be impacted by your work, right? And understanding what their organizational objectives are, right? And what you're trying to do is you're trying to maximize the outcomes across all of these different groups in this central area here. So somebody mentioned it earlier on already, but you'll have these organization-wide objectives normally, like measurable objectives. In some cases, they'll call them OKRs, objectives and key results. Sometimes they're called KPIs. Sometimes they don't even have a name, right? But they're things that everyone's moving towards, like increase sales, reduce costs, right? What you'll find though is that within individual departments, right, they've got their own set of goals and objectives, right? And some of those are explicit and they're written down somewhere. And some of them are more like, hey, you know what? Every time sales makes a purchase, it comes over to service and they've got the wrong expectations. So I actually am very sensitive to this thing. So when you are presenting your research, you may want to know all of that in order to know what to call out or what things to hedge when you're talking about in case there are any landmines, right? So taking this step and literally just identifying the impacted parties and identifying what their goals and objectives are is actually quite important. It'll take you a long time at first to do this, but as you get a sense over time, you don't have to do it every single time once you get to know it. And a big part of this as well too is you start to understand the downstream impacts of your recommendations, right? So you've done your research, you make a recommendation, and you think it's something awesome, and you say something to the effect of, hey, you know what we should do? We should make sure that everybody just gets onboarded directly into their online account after they make a purchase, right? And turns out, because you didn't really understand what was happening, there's something critical going on with service where customer service actually needs to have a conversation with somebody before they get in there and they start doing things or some other unexpected consequence. So this can actually really make sure that you don't make unintended downstream mistakes, right? Co-creation, right? When you're doing your research, you might be able to read somewhere online in your company what the objectives are for a specific department, right? But you actually want to go talk to that department and understand what their goals are, right? Even just the act of talking to some of the folks in that department starts bringing them into the fold of being part of this research and the outcomes with you, right? Participation in the actual research itself. That can be giving people a Zoom link or sharing videos of research. This can be helpful for engineers. You can get engineers who are advocates on your site if you do this, right? This could be certainly helpful for business unit stakeholders, right? That you might need them to be on board with getting any of your research implemented. And then when it comes to next steps, you certainly need to have different stakeholders involved because, well, they're going to be the ones that they have the ability to put the kibosh on what is it you're doing, or they have the ability to push what you're doing forward even faster than you might have thought it was possible, right? So why does this co-creation seem to work? Boom. Kara, I hope I got that right. Kara. Yep. Ownership, buy-in, pride, gets others involved. Yeah. You can have multiple folks from different departments. It becomes a stickier concept. The buy-in, the ownership is a big part, right? And it's kind of funny because you could potentially collect a lot of the information without ever talking to anybody. But the very act of engaging with those stakeholders, for some reason, in my experience, just creates that buy-in and that sense of ownership. You're now all playing on the same team, and you are now no longer the user researcher from a different department who is trying to get something done with their resources, right? You're now all in it together, right? Cool. So when you're honing your people skills, it's good to be aware when you're presenting your research results, right? This could be deciding how you're going to present your information. Some folks just want a spreadsheet with a bunch of solutions or recommendations, right? Some want to just get the findings and maybe work with you later on to develop those solutions together later, right? Or they want to understand a bit more about the findings before really jumping straight into a solution. Some stakeholders want to observe your interviews or your, maybe your live moderated tests, right? And kind of have a bit of a session in between those participants to say, hey, what could we do here? Or what should we do here? Some just want like, hey, give me the high level and send me a couple of video clips with that, right? And you will find that there's for sure some folks that are just very quant focused. So you might have done some really fantastic usability tests. You've probably even read that Norman Nielsen article that says you only ever need to have 5 usability participants, right? Maybe you've even sent that out. You're really on top of it, right? But you're just going to have some people that are very quant focused. So what you might need to do is find some of the themes in your qualitative feedback and look for quantitative support in other data areas in your organization, right? Or you might even want to start with the quant and say, hey, look, we've identified from the quantitative data that this type of transaction is the biggest pain point for us, and that's where we see the biggest drop off. And then you're coming in with the qualitative research to understand the why. And you could even do an A/B test after that if they're super quant and be like, yeah, we just want to make sure we got these recommendations right. So sometimes you will need to adapt your approach if folks are kind of more on the quant side, right? And of course, when we're talking about triangulation of research results, right, it's always better to be looking more broadly than just one methodology anyway. So there's a lot of benefit to this in general. Are people bored? That's a thing. That's the thing. Is your presentation at 5 o'clock on a Friday? You might, maybe you have the C-suite in there even, right? But like, they're people too, right? Like, maybe it's super boring, the thing that you're doing, right? So keep an eye out for the body language as you're going through, right? And it's okay to mix it up, right? If you're in the middle of the meeting and you see your key decision makers are just like nodding off, right? Just stop and be like, hey, look, just to sum up, these are the main points, and we'll shoot out the notes afterwards, blah, 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 right? But like, pay attention, because, that can be a killer in terms of, it can be great feedback for you, to be honest, which is, hey, the way the level of your communication, it could be too granular, right? The amount of time you're taking to present your results may just be too much, or it could be a case that you just hit people on a bad day and they've got 10 other fires that they're trying to put out and they're just not into this, right? So, paying attention for that feedback is actually very important. Anyone here got any examples of things they've lived where they had to adapt their approach to sharing their research findings?
I have a story that's not about, was one of the students going to jump in? So I have a story not about.
That's a great one. I'll like, you got me thinking now about a past experience I had with an unnamed company where we would periodically do very large research projects and present to 100+ managers, right? And it became a thing that everyone was into this, and exec would be there and they would be like, what is going on with this research, right? Like, what are we doing about this, right? And it got to the point where we would have to do pre-meetings before the presentation of the research, where we would show the research so that people in the meeting could actually be prepared and have already started on some of the changes, right? So before we even got to the research, it was all basically taken care of. And was that a little weird? Was that a little bit of show? Sure, but did the stuff get fixed and figured out? It did, right? But you find all these little quirks that you kind of adapt and figure out as you learn these things as you go along the way. So that was a great example, and thank you for sharing that. I think I'll just call out another one here from Chloe, which is make it as visually engaging as possible. I think that's great and accurate, and I'm putting out here prioritize spreadsheet solutions. That's not how I want to consume my research, for sure, right? Video clips are a great one as well too, where you can kind of make that visually attractive, right? But obviously, if you can do anything that isn't like a bunch of a lot of heavy text on a screen, that's the way to go, right? Managing expectations, setting expectations, right? What can go wrong in a usability test? This is one that everybody should literally have 25 different answers for. I'll settle for one. Yeah, everything. I've had a couple of those. All the technical difficulties, absolutely. Talking people how to share their Zoom, wrong participants. Yeah, that can even happen when you've gone through a really rigorous recruiting process and it turns out that, I don't know, someone misunderstood a question, someone lied on it, right? Like that happens, right? Some of these remote usability testing tools as well too. After a little while, those participants just get a bit savvy, become kind of expert participants, and are just like, I wonder what the right answers might be to get through this screener, and then I can get my $5 or $10 or $70, right? What else? One more. I'll stop asking after one more. Oh, rogue participants. I love that. Uncooperative participants. Yeah, there's that as well, for sure. Data collection issues. Yeah. I will take a minute just on the rogue participants or uncooperative participants, because I think that is like a really common one. Like I would say in my very non-scientific estimate, like if I wanted to do a usability test with 5 participants, I'd recruit 7, because one's a no-show and one's just like super out there, right? Or, look, you guys, I'm sure, are even better moderators and facilitators than I am. And sometimes you just get that one participant and you're asking them to talk out loud, and you're really just not getting that much, right? No matter what you do and how many prompts you put in there, right? So absolutely 100%, right? So no-shows are also a thing, right? We talked about the screening process not being perfect. Another one is you might not get through all the tasks and questions. For every one person that you have to pull teeth to get them to talk out loud, there's another person who really, really wants to talk out loud, and you just might not get through all the tasks. And that's a really good reason as to why you should be prioritizing those anyway, right? You might need to explain the value of qualitative research, right? And having some of these conversations with your stakeholders ahead of time can just help manage those expectations. Some people take it really badly if like you get a no-show and they're like, oh, I wasted all my time on this and you get 2 no-shows. It's like, yeah, well, that's kind of like the game, right? But if this is the first time your organization is doing usability testing, it can be good to give them a little bit of a primer so they're not disappointed when some of these common things actually happen. Driving action. That sounds good, doesn't it? I would love some action on this. Yeah, great. So here are some, often when folks talk about things you should do, right, to have to be a better user experience leader, they don't actually give you the words, right? Which is really frustrating for me sometimes. It's like, I don't know if you've ever been in college and got some feedback and someone's just like highlighted a whole paragraph and they're like, tighten up the wording. And you're like, okay, but like how, right? So here are some examples of phrases that I use, right, that have helped me, right, to move research forward, right? Let's say you're in a meeting and nobody is deciding on what the next steps are, right? And those meetings are important. You've presented your research, you kind of got to get some momentum going, right? You can say something, you can lead it, right? Take a stab if nobody's taking a stab and say, based on X and Y observations, I hypothesize we should Y unless there are objections, right? And there's a lot of things going on in this sentence, right? First off, you're basing on observations, right? It's not a feeling. You're providing the evidence. You're saying, I hypothesize because you may have someone in that room who feels really strongly that your assessment is not correct, right? And so you're setting this up as more of a test and learn thing, right? And people can come in and they might have another hypothesis, right? And unless there are any objections here, what that is doing is like, hey, like everybody's got feedback, right? But we want to try something here. So let me know if there's like a major objection to this. Otherwise, let's try something and test it and see if it's better, right? When you end some of these meetings with your research, trying to get some commitment on next steps before the meeting ends can be important, right? I mentioned this earlier on, but like that peer effect of there's lots of people in a room and all eyes are on kind of what are next steps is really helpful in a group session versus if you do something one-on-one and like someone just doesn't want to do it, it might just die on the vine there. But when you're in that group setting, you want to kind of seize that momentum. So, you want to say something like, even if you haven't figured out what you're actually going to do, what the recommendations are, because that's entirely possible, you can just say, as a next step, we'll meet with X and these different people by X date to determine whatever. Like that determination can actually be just the next step can be determining next steps, what you're actually getting that on the calendar, and you've got that kind of public commitment, right? And public commitments more specifically, right? What can happen is you're following up afterwards and just nobody's responding and it's not going anywhere, right? And you might want to say, hey, look, I think we should do this as the recommended fix, right? And so you can kind of lead in with, please review this by X date and let me know if you object before we proceed, right? You're putting a timeline on it because sometimes when you don't do that, it just dies completely on the vine as well too, right? Again, you're not asking for everybody to thumbs up something. You're saying, hey, let me know if you object, right? And in the hopefully unlikely scenario that you're still not getting momentum because there's no engagement, you might even just move forward, right? You might have to talk to other leadership to make sure that that doesn't blow up in your face, right? But in some cases, you will just find that you have one or two stakeholders that just will not chime in or answer your feedback in a timely fashion. And you really want to make sure that doesn't become a blocker to actually progress in your organization, right? And here's the other one. Instead of saying, when can you X, ask, how soon can you? That implies a sense of urgency. And instead of somebody saying, hey, yeah, well, we can definitely take a look at that research and maybe see what our options are and get back to you, I don't know, like in 2 weeks, right? They're thinking now, hey, okay, can we do it Wednesday this week? Or, you've put them in a different mindset, right? And you don't want to let it kind of drag on. There should always be kind of a sense of urgency with this type of stuff, right? Because obviously research can go stale as well too, or you can just lose momentum on the initiative. So your UX, right, or HCI or product design, right? It's not necessarily always your job to come up with a business case, right? Sometimes that's other departments. You want to try and do that though, right? That is a very helpful thing to do if you actually want your ideas to become reality in organizations, right? You want to avoid business cases that sound like this new thing will significantly increase sales because you have no idea how much that is, right? And when you're trying to prioritize those initiatives later on, somebody just says, yeah, this will increase sales. There's like 700 ideas out there that are like, this will increase sales or decrease costs, right? You really want to try and quantify, if you can, what that is so that people can actually have a better confidence that this actual thing is going to help the business, right? So like we talked about, you can try and figure out some creative math on how much do you think this might increase sales by. A really common one in UX is automation, like automation of a process to be self-service, right? And an easy enough way to kind of quantify the benefit of some of that is, and it's not super technical, is you just time how long it takes a human being to do it and multiply it by the number of transactions, right? And then you can get a sense of the overall time savings. You can even multiply that by the cost of, the person doing it if you wanted to, right? And that's one other way that you can kind of quantify the value of some of the stuff that you do, right? The other one to just call out here is thinking about, is there capacity for your initiative, right? There might be a high level of effort, ideal recommendation coming out of your research, and there might be a low level of effort alternative that might get you 80% of the value. And you should really try and be familiarizing yourself with the roadmap in your organization. What is actually the engineering capacity of the teams that might be involved in making that change, right? And all of this that I'm talking about is not something that you have to do on your own. Probably not even something I would advise you do on your own, right? Partnering up with product managers, partnering up with other people in the business to help use the business case together can be far more effective than you kind of even trying it yourself, right? And I would say, try to be a product designer, right? What do I mean by that? So there's a UX designer and there's a product designer. And I'm sure in lots of places they're the exact same thing. But what I mean by this is what you see if you go to LinkedIn and you start looking for trends in terminology for designers, right? You'll see that the typically more forward-looking states like California and New York, right? Those that tend to have they're further ahead on their UX design best practices, right? Use the phrase product designer, right? And so that got me curious and was like, well, what is that? How is that different from a UX designer, right? And of course, anytime anyone's ever done research knows that there's never a good answer to what's the definition of something. That's just like what it is, right? There's 7 million of them, right? But a common theme is that product designers aren't just focused on user experience and what the user thinks. They're also focused on the business, right? They understand what the business is thinking, right? So I don't really care if folks are using that terminology or not. The point here is try and consider things from a business perspective as well too, because I would say that there's lots of places where if you're a UX designer and you don't consider things from the business perspective, you're probably going to be unemployed, right? So that is another way to look at this. Cool. So we have gone through a lot of different things here, right? And I want to ask you to think about some of the different things that we've run through, right? And this is all about how can you get your research to turn into real business action, right? Is there any common theme that you are identifying across many of these different things that we're talking about? Maybe another way to think about it as well too is there anything that you think is distinctly not being mentioned as we've talked through some of this? Yeah, getting public commitments. Yep, that certainly plays into it. Everyone's a politician. Yep. And I think understand how business works, where you are to help you understand how to get things done. Yes. Yep. Absolutely. These are all exactly on point and correct, right? And I think the thing I'd call out is I'm not here and I'm not saying, you know what you need to do. You need to better learn and understand your user research methodologies, right? Like that's kind of the price of entry for this stuff. And honestly, maybe I wish it was different, right? But like beyond a certain degree, you're going to be the only one that understands the quality of your research methodology, right? And in lots of cases, something is better than nothing, like in lots of businesses, right? But you're all appropriately pointing out here that, at least in my experience, the theme is around people, right? It's not actually around your individual contributor skills or your methodologies, right? The key to getting things done is actually all about your people skills and understanding your organizational environment, right? So, is there anything from your experience that we might have missed? Obviously, I'm perfect, and there's nothing that I have missed that's just clear and true, but just in case, I'm going to ask this question. We have some of the brightest minds in the country here. Give it a shot. What else? What else helps? Think about your own experiences. Overbearing, overinterested stakeholders. Yeah. 1,000%. That's exactly right. Yeah, you can, actually, instead of me guessing, that is such a great example. I'm really glad you shared it. That is very common. I don't have a fantastic solution for that one, for sure, right? The only thing that I will say is in startups, what can happen sometimes is that in the very early stages of business, you have executives that actually, it's very beneficial in many cases, maybe not all cases, like the one that you're speaking to, right? To be quite involved in what's being produced. But as the business grows and scales over time, like it can become literally impossible for them to be involved in all the different meetings for all the different initiatives, right? So in a healthy company, as you grow over time, you kind of scale out of that because the CEO or the other folks, they really probably shouldn't be spending as much time in every single research initiative, but certainly in the early stages or in a smaller company, that can be a thing. Even, I mean, it can happen in a big company too, right? Don't get me wrong, but like I've seen that as more of a trend in a smaller company. That is a tough one. I think, in scenarios like that, kind of trying to encourage test and learn or disagree and commit kind of atmospheres can help, but just getting that to happen can be like a slow road, right? Like that, what you're calling it is really real and really tough to handle. Let's look at some other ones here. We got overbearing stakeholders plus 7%. Socializing insights is hard to do well, but it is important. That's so great. And the reality is you might start a couple of projects, and if your organization is just new to it, like no matter how good you do on the first couple, it might take a little while for folks to kind of get buy-in with some of the stuff, right? Or it could be the case that you got to keep banging that drum and beating it and repeating the same thing over and over again to the same different folks. But for sure that if you get into that spot, it's not super enjoyable to do. But the one thing I will say is, when you get above that kind of IC level, you might end up just repeating the mantra of things like, what is the UX process or UX best practices, right? It's almost like when you see companies doing their core principles, like there's basically just no point in doing that one time in a meeting. You just have to keep repeating it and repeating it and repeating it because people don't remember it until you repeat it and repeat it, right? And unfortunately, sometimes that's the case with your results, right? But I think that's a great call out for, you want to be precise with the level of effort that you're expending on that. Like maybe you only want to do it for really big things that you think are going to have a lot of value, right? Because it can, of course, become draining. Thank you for sharing. Patient is your timeline vision doesn't match the org's timeline vision. That's exactly correct, right? I like lots of times I've seen this stuff take a long time. Like I might even have thought like, hey, this vision is clear, right? Obviously we're going to be on this track in 3 months, and maybe 2 years later, you're still trying to get people on board with it, right? One thing that I have found to be somewhat helpful in that regard is sometimes visualizing future mock-ups, right, of what the experience will be. Like having like some objective, like increase sales by 4 million, just for some reason isn't quite as convincing as like showing a storyboard or an experience of what that could be. So sometimes that can help, but other times you're just you're strapping in for that long, slow road. Sarah, I'm intrigued. Go for it.
I think it's similar to Chloe's, but when you get someone who just really thinks they know the right way to do things and is very wrong, and you have to navigate through those dynamics, especially if there's a power differential.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, in those scenarios, right? Like, I mean, you're probably trying to find, okay, like it's some exec, right? And you're probably trying to, like, you're probably not the only one that's noticed it. There's probably some other execs who are like, oh my God, right? And you're trying to form some of those alliances. So you're setting up some of those meetings ahead of time because you kind of know what's going to come up, right? And you're trying to do something like, okay, yeah, well, why don't we test it, right? Or having some of that prep ahead of time. But again, those are real world difficult things to overcome for sure. I think we have about 5 minutes left on this. So let me stop talking, and I'm happy to answer any additional questions that folks may have related to this or completely unrelated to this. Silence is your friend in moderation. Not talking, right? Like that's a really important skill. We've got some. If a project you worked on for months gets shelved, do you add it to your portfolio? I might, if it's good, sure. Like things can get shelved for reasons that are not, it's a great experience, right? Organizational priorities could change. In fact, I can think of lots of projects that got shelved where it was a really good idea. Maybe the funding wasn't there. So yeah, absolutely. I mean, you want to be careful, right? Like if you're speaking to it in an interview and you think it's going to come up as like, what's the most value you've ever delivered for an organization, right? You want to be a little bit careful with it. But I think if you upfront it and you kind of package it as, hey, this is like, it got shelved for a reason that is like not, this is a terrible idea and would have tanked the company. I think you can use it for sure. How do you think we can develop these skills as students or junior UX researchers? I mean, I think you develop these skills I felt like I started developing these skills in college when I wasn't doing anything at work, right? It's like, it's really understanding in project groups, like I don't think it's that different to understand how do you influence people, how do you understand how you're going to pitch something in a class to get a higher mark, right? Like things like that, right? I think you could start that. In terms of actually like super getting this experience, there's probably no substitute for just getting into a company and doing it, which is probably not exactly what you want to hear, right? But I think just even listening to the unique examples and the weird bugaboos that come up, you can't really, like, there's only so much simulation you can do. And then there's more of just making sure you lean into it instead of like not engaging with the politics or not engaging with this, that, and the other to move it forward. I think that would be the biggest mistake, right? What do we have here? Otherwise, I'd have nothing in my portfolio. What is the most important aspect of a portfolio? The what facts of how it happened, or the why of your decision-making reasons? It could depend. Like if you're trying to get a user research job, maybe the why is more important. I'll speak for myself. Like I see a lot of portfolios. I don't even really read or care about the use cases that are written out or described at this point. Like I can look at a lot of UIs and have a good sense of if that is someone who has thought about a user or is a good design user, right? Obviously, I am not the user, right? All of those caveats, right? But you can tell a really bad design from a portfolio typically, right? So I would say it depends. and the what, at least if for a UX designer, I think is pretty important. The why, I think, is pretty important for a user researcher. If you can do both, great. Most big companies are hiring only PhD level UX researchers. Is the career trajectory usually to work at startups and then transition over? So I have noticed that as well too. A theory on this is that, there are some folks doing PhDs not in HCI fields, like political science, whatever it is. They get into that field, they realize that they can't actually get a job in the field that they wanted to get in, but they actually have strong research methodologies, and then they get into it. What I'll say is, like, I don't actually know that. Sure, PhD is important, but a lot of user research is just about like raw experience doing the stuff, right? So I don't know that all of those companies are going to preference a PhD. Like, I'm hiring for a senior user researcher now, and there are PhDs that I would not hire that do not have the practical experience to do it, right? So is the career trajectory usually to work in startups and then transition over? No, I don't think so. I mean, you for sure, if you can't get your foot in the door, yes, but there's a whole bunch of like medium and large sized companies that are just like looking to get UX started, right? Even though they're bigger, right? And you could still get in there. You could honestly be a UX designer somewhere, just do a bit more research if that's what you wanted to do in that role, and then kind of spin that as, you have that experience in your next interview, right? Is it okay to apply for positions that you say PhD if you feel you have the experience or is looked down upon? Yeah, sure. Absolutely. Give it a shot. In fact, there's a lot of research to show that certain segments of the population don't apply because they think that the qualifications are too high, and then all the other folks are just like slamming in those resumes, right? So I would. I'd go to LinkedIn and I'd contact someone on LinkedIn before I'd even go through the HR process, right? Just in case I get screened out there. Along the same lines as the what, why questions, what works best for you in terms of getting core user pain points, motivations? People usually don't say what they need. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So, this is the age-old triangulation of research methods piece, which is I like to observe or look at behavioral analytics to really understand what people are doing. But you might want to combine that with some sort of like attitudinal survey or user interviews to understand why are they doing certain things, but combining those two, I think is helpful. Anyone on their own, I think, suffers from the limitations you're talking about here. If I didn't answer that question, please feel free to let me know and I can have another crack at that. In your experience, what qualities make for a good qualitative researcher? Patience, actually, right? Like, I don't know that I was always the best moderator, right? Sometimes I would get a bit frustrated, right? And there's some people that are just super cool and calm. I think that's very helpful for, participants that maybe, all the issues that we talked about, right? I think attention to detail, like if you're looking at user interviews and you're trying to code different themes across those interviews, right? You have to have grit and resilience to get through all that kind of copy and verbiage, but you also have to have that attention to detail to identify the different themes in all of the content that you have, right? Identifying patterns is probably a good one as well too. What else do we have here? I've been looking at salary data and I'm getting the impression, well, let me just pause here for a second because I'm conscious of time. Sarah, can I finish off these questions or okay. I've been looking at salary data and I'm getting the impression that without a master's PhD, your salary will level off after 10 years. Do you think that's true? I'm not confident about using the data. So this is great. Doing salary research is like such a weird thing in this space, right? And I've done some of this recently. Here's what I'll say. I don't know that I think whether you have a PhD or a master's is going to guarantee that your salary is going to level off, because I doubt that matters once you go beyond an individual contributor level, right? Like if you're, I don't think that if you go and look at every VP of user experience or chief experience officer, that every single one of those folks has a PhD, right? So I don't know that I would necessarily think that you would get capped. Salary research is really tough, right? The free tools that are out there, not always super accurate. A lot of companies are paying for proprietary salary information, right? But even that, you're just looking at one look at the data, right? So your only option in most cases is to get a sense of, like, salary.com, or go to a couple of places. Like, I wouldn't look at one source of data. I would just like look at a couple of them, see if you can see a trend. The one thing that I will say is I did this recently and I looked at the trends across different states. And so what I think is happening right now in the market is remote has become a norm, right? Or is very possible for a lot of companies. But salaries in some cases are still stuck in this legacy of geography, right? So what you're seeing is in California and New York, historically higher paying areas, they're open to remote folks, right? Much more open to remote folks now. And you'll see that in places that geographically, historically paid a lot less. Like, there's no reason for you not to apply for a job in California and benefit from that cost of living of Montana, right? But get that premium jump, right? So I would certainly be careful of limiting yourself to, like, I'm just going to look locally, because I think right now there's going to be a lot of talent drainage from places that are not adjusting their salaries due to locations, right? PhDs don't make financial sense. How do you talk about this? Anyone? Maybe not the first person who said that. What are your suggestions for entry-level UX researchers interested in VR, AR? Do I need to have related projects in the portfolio? I don't know. I won't speak to that because that's not necessarily my field. What I'll say is that it is a new field. So my guess is that, a lot of people are not going to have that experience. And if you're really trying to grow that, like if you're a Facebook and they're just like on a hiring surge right now, or a Meta, I bet they don't have all folks with VR or AR experience, right? So I would apply if it was me. Some companies are adjusting their salaries. So do ask about this. Yes, exactly right. Exactly right. And they're trying to do all sorts of things now. Like, they might have flexibility on a signing on bonus. You should ask about that, right? So just know that if you get a signing on bonus, that's not going to be your salary forever, right? So just be careful with that stuff. But absolutely, this is a time where you could end up losing a lot of money if you don't shop around appropriately and actually make sure you negotiate when you start your role. Great questions. Great participation along the way, guys. Really, really appreciate it. My name is Kevin Philpott. There's not that many of us, right? So if you want to connect with me on LinkedIn and ask an additional question or anything you want, happy to do that. And you guys have been absolutely fantastic.
Thank you so much, Kevin. Really appreciate your talk and sticking around to answer questions. This was great. It's always nice to connect with people, and I think the students, I know I learned a lot, and so I think we all did. And it's late, so I also appreciate you powering through this late night talk. I'm also on the East Coast, so
I know. Have a great one, folks. Really appreciate it. I think you're doing a great course, and just so you know, this is a really fantastic field. Like there's a lot of job satisfaction. There's a lot of money in this field right now, right? So congratulations. Take care.